Welcome to today's event at this year's Swindon Festival of Literature, which, as a result of restrictions to prevent the spread of that virus, has become a virtual online festival of literature. Thank you very much for joining us. Now, we do hope that everything is well where you are. We are both pleased and grateful that human ingenuity, cutting-edge science, and digital technology make it possible for this show to go on. Well, at least to go on online. Now, for better or for worse, it's possible that events of the last year have got a lot more of us talking and thinking about our lives, and more significantly, our lifespan. Life is interesting and tricky, but it seems we find that death is even trickier, or certainly dealing with it. So it may be no bad thing that a newly published book offers 9 rules to conquer death. And here it is. 9 rules to conquer death. Please join me in giving a Swindon Festival of Literature welcome to today's guest author, BAFTA-winning filmmaker, Emmy nominee, and bardic poet, Kevin Toolis. Kevin, welcome.
Welcome. Thank you, Matt, for inviting me. It's lovely to be here, even virtually in Swindon, a town that I know a little bit about because I've appeared at the Swindon Festival before, and I think I've passed through it, sometimes on journeys to doing documentary films for Channel 4. A balmy place, I remember. Sometimes the climate is almost like Paris. Yeah.
Well, I was just about to ask you, and I'm so glad that you mentioned you have been to Swindon before. But we're online, and you are across the sea in Ireland, so you're not with us in Swindon today. But nevertheless, thanks very much for joining us. Okay, Kevin, we better get on to the topic in hand, your book, 9 Rules to Conquer Death. And it says things like this in your book. It says many things, but it says things like this. Learning how to die is like learning how to live, because the two are indivisible. Kevin Toolis, please tell us more.
But I suppose I wrote 9 Rules to Conquer Death and thought about these rules because of my own sort of slight dual identity, in that although I grew up in Scotland, I grew up in a very sort of strong Irish tradition, and my family all come from this remote island, Achill Island, off the west coast of Ireland, where people have a very different attitude towards social death. One of my aunts, for instance, died just in December of last year. And a bit scarily, even with the COVID restrictions, she had a full-scale Irish wake, and in which her body was in the coffin, open coffin, next to the Christmas tree in the house. And many people came. A lot of people came with masks and things, but a lot of people saw her and touched her and kissed her, and she was there for a couple of days. And people had, even beyond the COVID pandemic, they have a much more open and understanding attitude towards death, and this obviously impacts the rest of their life. I mean, you sort of can't go to wakes and funerals in the number in which the Irish do go without getting some empathetic understanding of the human condition. I mean, some deaths are tragic. Not all deaths are tragic. Some of them just at the end of a natural lifespan. But obviously, you learn in that forum how to conduct yourself, how people deal with grief. Obviously, some deaths are terribly unexpected, accidents. I mean, the worst of all possible things that can happen. And yet, this very old tradition of the Irish wake, which persists around the world in many, many different cultures. It's really the English a very odd way of silencing death, actually. That this exists as a way, really a mechanism by which we teach ourselves and the coming generation one of the most important lessons you will ever learn in life, which is, it may sound strange, how to live and how to die, because you can't abstract the two. It's not that somehow death is just going to come at the end of your life. You have to be able to understand the grief that other people have, the meaning of these accidents, things that happen even as you're growing up as a school kid, things that happen. Some people will, in every generation, die prematurely. We all know that life is this great sort of learning experience. So what I wanted to do in 9 Rules to Conquer Death was really kind of codify that in these really simple rules that can help you, guide you through. These are actually the most significant things that will ever happen to you in your life, which is the death of significant others, sometimes the death of strangers. A lot of the time in our cultural life and artistic life, in films, theatre, in fables, there's a big sort of shootout, and then people get up, you know, and they live to learn another day. Or, I mean, how many of us watch Hollywood movies where there's endless bullets being fired, but they never hit the hero or the heroine, who sort of continues on triumphantly, sort of killing the bad guys, who just sort of lie down dead and there are no consequences, you know. But in real life, what happens is that people, if they do get hit by bullets, they don't get up, and we all have to learn how to sort of cope with that, to sort of have a mechanism. So what I've really done is try to condense what I learned through a lifetime of exposure as a writer to the wakes that I've encountered here in Achill Island, but also seeing that in other cultures. Because another part of my life, I worked as a reporter. I did quite a bit of time in the Middle East, making films about terrorism and suicide bombing. And I did a bit of famine and plague reporting in Africa as well, places like Malawi, Sudan, and Kenya. Again, it's really interesting, our current time, talking about like pandemics, and having seen the AIDS pandemic fairly close up in Africa, what it teaches you. Sometimes it teaches you about the most noble things in human society. I remember in Malawi, when I was reporting on the pandemic there during the AIDS pandemic, I was always struck how incredibly quietly stoic the people were when they were confronting a disease which was, though curable in the West, it wasn't curable in poor parts of Africa because people just didn't have the money for the drugs. And how do you go on in the worst of times? How do you go on without? I mean, we have the miracle of the vaccine to save us, we think, but how do you go on if there wasn't a vaccine? And we might think that that's a terrible, unacceptable situation. But of course, that's precisely the situation that our ancestors lived through for tens of thousands of years. I mean, it's only recently in the last 200 years that what I would call really the Western death machine has reshaped our understanding of mortality by silencing death. Some of it a very good invention, like through medical science, the fall in infant mortality. We have palliative care, we have Western hospitals. But what we've really done is we've also abstracted death from our daily lives in a way in which would be very foreign and alien, even to our Victorian foremothers and forefathers, who would have experienced death on a personal level through infant mortality. I mean, if you go into a 19th century graveyard, I'm sure in Swindon, if you went into the 19th century graveyards in Swindon and you looked at the Victorian gravestones, you would often find 5 children, infants, would be listed on every family memorial. I often look at people on the TV and they were talking about the death of a child, which they say is a tragedy. And they say, you know, it's something that should never happen in our to anyone, you know, the death of a child. And I can understand how painful the death of a child is, but it's worth pointing out that up until 2 or 3 generations ago, it was an absolutely common experience, even amongst people who were actually wealthy, that they lost a child, that up to 50% of your children would die in infancy. And this was part of the human story. So it's worth kind of remembering these, you might say, existential constructs from our experience as a species, from our ancestors, what it was like to be human. And to be human is actually to be mortal. So one of the first rules in 9 Rules to Conquer Death is the one thing in life that you will never get to choose is being mortal. You are mortal. And when you stop being mortal, you become a dead one of us, a dead human. But as long as you are breathing, you are still part of the great mortal us. And that brings with it certain responsibilities, because you cannot, if you're indifferent to the fate of others who are part of the great mortal us, strangers who you might see on the TV, friends, families, work colleagues, if you think, well, their death doesn't really mean anything, then of course, what you're really saying is my death doesn't mean anything either. I'm not really part of this human mortal community. It's like John Donne, is that you're saying, well, I am a separate island unto myself. Whereas John Donne, the famous English poet, would say, you know, no man is an island. We're all part of this great kind of commonwealth. We all share this great common bond of our mortality. And that's why things like funerals and the recognition of other people's grief, the ability to actually reach out to say to even a fairly distant colleague who you've heard who they've suffered a loss, their mother has died, their father has died or something, to be able to go up to them and give a sort of public expression of grief and sorrow, saying, I am sorry about your loss. To be able to publicly acknowledge that is part of that connection of being part of the great mortal us, and one of the rules of 9 Rules to Conquer Death. I mean, it's often said, I don't know if it's the same really in Swindon, that the English are incredibly uncomfortable about death, and they will, you know, walk to the other side of the road to avoid having to encounter someone who is recently bereaved. Very much in the Irish experience and in the Irish wake tradition, it's the exact opposite. Is people feel under a social obligation to go out of their way to acknowledge your loss, so that people will cross the street to shake your hand, and even in a kind of cliched form to say, I'm sorry for your trouble. I'm sorry, I heard that your father had died a month ago or 3 months ago. And they will go out, the first time they see you, they will be under this moral compulsion. This was pre-COVID, obviously, to literally go up and shake your hands and say it personally, look you in the eye and say, I'm sorry for your trouble. So it's very much the reverse. It's really quite an interesting psychology. And although this stream of mourners coming up to you sometimes months afterwards in the supermarket as you're buying a tin of baked beans can be a little bit, sometimes people be a little bit intrusive. At the same time, it's the reverse of the isolation of grief. Those who often lose a significant other, lose a partner, lose a wife, a husband, whatever, feel that their whole world has been kind of ripped away, that their universe has shrunk and been torn apart, whereas the rest of the world just goes on completely indifferently, as it does. And people can feel trapped and isolated, that there's no public expression for their grief. But on those little human gestures, like going up, having a wide sense of social connection, of being able to say, without embarrassment, I heard about the loss of your father, I'm sorry, try to shake your hand. What they're doing all the time, this human connection, is that you're entering into this private world of grief. You're publicizing this grief. You're saying, I accept that your world has changed forever. It's important, it's significant. This isn't just some sort of little bump that we've got through 2 days or a week of a funeral, and we all go back to pretending that life has gone on for you as it was before, you know, and it also gives you an allowance to be, you know, grief-stricken, to acknowledge that your world has changed, and to get others to acknowledge. So that's just a really kind of simple way in which this ancient ritual, the Irish Wake, which is mentioned in the Iliad in some form, written by Homer in 750 BC, about a war that took place in 750 BC. No, 1300 BC, written by Homer in 750 BC. He obviously talks about a ritual incredibly akin to the Irish Wake. This is for the death of Hector. He talks about basically feasting. He talks about keening. He talks about people gathering together. He talks about burial, and that the acknowledgement of Hector's death as a really significant moment. So it goes back in history for so long, and it has embedded within it many, many therapeutic rituals, which I think are useful for coping with grief and death. I mean, one of the, again, sometimes when I give talks, and this is worth saying to people in Swindon at the festival, one little test is, can you take your right hand now and count off on the fingers of your right hand how many corpses that you have seen, touched, kissed, and embraced in your entire life? And would that count actually manage to come to the fingers on your left hand? Or is it just one or two or three? And how could that be in a world where everyone is mortal? How can it be so rare and privileged that we never see the bodies of the dead? Yet in Ireland, which is pretty much the same kind of country in many ways, you know, the same shops. I go and shop in Aldi and Lidl and eat pretty much the same kind of food as people do in Britain. Often watch many of the same kinds of TV programs. Your average middle-class person, because they would have grown up in this much more open funereal tradition, would have seen not just two or three, but possibly by the time in their middle age, maybe hundreds of dead bodies. That they would go to wakes, they would go to funerals, they would see there that, like my aunt, there would be the bodies of the dead would be lying there on public open show, and not necessarily always tragic and sad, because it's just that chain of human community is bigger and wider, and death is more of a sort of every other day sort of event. It's not a special event, it's just part of that life. But again, it is quite interesting if you don't have much familiarity with the sight and touch of the dead. Because I mean, there's one thing about the dead that really strikes you the first time is you know, you can sort of touch them, you can whisper in their ear, you can tell them that you love them, or you can actually tell them that you've always hated their guts. The thing is, like, they never react. They don't say anything at all. You just sort of lie there, looking, you know, pretty dead. And the other thing is actually that the dead are really bad at pretending. In the rest of our lives, we often lie all the time. We say, "Oh, your hair looking green. I think it looks really suits you." Yeah, I'm definitely going to be there this weekend. No, your arse does not look. All of that sort of stuff. We say, or I love you. We often go back on ourselves. You know, we reverse. We say, we're sorry. I didn't mean to break that. I'll never touch another drink again. But there's no reverse gear once you're dead. You're just there, lying there. Whatever has been in that person's life has become, a has been, a was. There is no future, the finality of it all. Even the touch of the dead is very interesting. You see, as you are sitting here watching me, wherever you're watching me from, see that fist? Your heart is pumping blood round your body at 2 pounds per square inch of pressure. Live human beings, like all of us watching, we're big kind of meaty, inflated balloons. But the minute that you cut that pump, all that pressure disappears. And we actually, what happens is the blood drains from your face. This maybe, I might say this sounds a bit morbid, but actually it's this incredible physical transformation between being part of the living us and them. The blood drains away. Your fingers turn a very kind of ivory yellow. You don't look well. In fact, actually, the dead, they just don't look well at all. And they're cold. That's the thing that is just incredible. Every human being that you have ever touched before in love or anger is a warm-blooded mammal. But the dead are so cold. They're cold like a stone and the ground outside cold, that when the first time you actually touch the dead, the first time I remember touching my personal dead, I touched my dead brother Bernard when I was 19 and he was 28 and I just died of leukemia. I was actually really shocked that this perfect facsimile of this being that I had loved had been replaced almost what I thought was a sort of marble stone that just it looked exactly like him. But of course it was him. He was just dead. And that again, it's that existential shock of transformation. I don't want to kind of try to overstress this, but that moment of encounter between the living us and that dead them is the very epicenter of all human civilization, spawning an eternal quest for eternal life and numerous priesthoods and religions and holy books and wars and persecutions of other millions of other heretics who have failed to believe in the same vision of a deathless God that we have. Literally from that moment, when you touch that dead body. So it is an amazing existential experience, and it is incredibly important in the whole history of our species. And it's almost like a gift that we have in the Western death machine, by the denial of death, by the removal of the sick away from hospitals, made worse, it must be said, hopefully temporarily by the COVID pandemic. We've removed ourselves actually from the gift of the sight of the dead, because they are everything and nothing like us. They are our future selves, really, or the future abnegation of ourselves, who was once living, thinking the same as us, pretty much the same kinds of thoughts and wants and desires, and now have become this utterly different thing, but at the same moment still containing that same form. One of the other passages in the book, in 9 Rules to Conquer Death, is if someone ever says to you, if you're in the body, in the company of one of your beloved dead, they say, just forget about it. They're just a shell. You've got the right and licensing to give them a slap, because the person that you loved never existed outside that body. That was part of intrinsically who they were. Obviously, they're no longer there. And that's what we struggle with our mortality. And it's the basis of sort of religion, because we want to understand this moment of physical transformation. How can this being that we love, this great animating current of personality, this great animating current of personality somehow not be there, yet they are so present? Anyway, so that's 9 Rules to Conquer Death. That's some of them, the rules. I would end really with a kind of much more upbeat, optimistic rule, is remember every day to live your life like it was a Wednesday. Because on Wednesdays, unlike, thank God it's Friday, unlike Saturday nights, are the kind of day where you just live for yourself. And that's one of the most important things, to remember to live for yourself in life. Yeah.
Kevin, thank you very much. One of the things I like about your book one of the things I like about your book is that it has either one or more question mark on every single page. It's very unusual to come across books like that, because books are usually lectures or certainties or stories or something concrete. But in saying the things you do, as people have heard you now, and writing the things you do, you keep questioning them, which makes me feel, and I hope it will make readers feel the same way, that we can have a dialogue with you. We can question what you say. And I do have some questions. One of them is this question of fear of dying, the big question. And it's interesting that you titled the book 9 Rules to Conquer Death, because you could have said 9 Rules to Conquer Fear of Death. And if one looks at the synonyms for conquer, it's defeat, overcome, get the better of. And that's not really, in my opinion, what you're saying. You're actually, I would have said, it's something more to do with accepting death, not conquering it. And that's what this book does all the time. It makes you think all the time. So I want to ask the question about why shouldn't we be afraid of dying, bearing in mind that we are a natural being, a slightly sophisticated amoeba in which cells are dividing, and we're part of a reproductive cycle. And that's really in the same as the buds on the trees in spring, the same as the worms in the ground. The life force is the strongest force in us. So the gazelle runs away from the tiger because the tiger threatens them with death. So isn't it okay for us also to behave that way? Now, I'm playing slight devil's advocate here because I'm not sure I completely agree with that. But I want to ask you, who's thought about this a lot, why isn't it all right to be afraid of death?
Well, on one level, we think about death 4 or 5 times an hour. We think, walking down these stairs, eating this biscuit, the cheese in the fridge, anytime that we're near traffic, crossing a road, unconsciously, you've got to think about the death possibilities. If I step out onto the road and that lorry is going past, it's going to knock me, it's going to kill me down. So we think about this kind of all the time. But so it's not the case. Often people say, why have you written a book about death? No one ever wants to think about that. We think about death probably about 20, 30 times a day in the sense of avoiding death. And I think of avoiding death too. But there is also beyond that, there is a kind of an existential level where we do realize that we're actually mortal. And that's another part of 9 Rules to Conquer Death, is that if I said to you, what do you think if we got to live forever? Some people might think, oh, that sounds like a really great plan. But once you begin to pick away at that, you realize that living forever would be an absolute nightmare, because the future and the present would collapse into one another. And there would be no change, no stasis, no things like, if you live forever, do you ever have children? What will you do with all your time? Our very concept of becoming, you go to university to do an engineering degree because you think it's a good career, you earn a lot of money. But if you were going to live forever, why not go to university for 3,000 years? Or why not play on the All England football team for 10,000 years? All of these things just become completely nonsensical. So embedded within us, existentially, is a concept of mortality. We think about, when I grow old, and what am I going to do in my 40s? And we often spend, even my own children now who are 20, often are berating themselves or congratulating for themselves on things that they have or have not done in their 20s. I did my A levels, I did this and such and such. So the point really here is we do realize we're mortal. So how do we cope with that mortality? Do we basically look at the ground all the time wondering, oh my God, there's a hole here I'm going to fall down? Do we sort of existentially go around in fear? Or do we actually learn to kind of lift our head up and look at the horizon and say, yeah, I am one day going to die, and it's going to be okay. And it's okay to accept that you know, you've got a certain time on Earth. If you get beyond a certain age, then you've done well. You know, statistically, let's say we've often got this thing, you know, do you want to live to be 100? So if you live to be 100 and you're a man, you've got a 1 in generally 25,000 chance of that happening. So another 25,000 men are going to die before you get to be that centenarian. If you're a woman, it's 1 in 5,000. On a practical level, most of us, if we do very well, will die in between our 70s and 80s. Old age doesn't come alone. It comes with lots of different debilitating illnesses. So it's just that profound acceptance at the end that it's okay. It's okay to be mortal. And Homer writes about this in the Iliad, often in books.
But of course, it's okay to be mortal, and of course,
yeah,
we know that. I don't think anybody is kidding themselves. And this question of living longer, we often have a game after supper and say, how long would you like to live? And everybody says a number, but nobody reveals it until we all reveal it. And then we discuss. And some people say, three score years and 10 is fine. 3 score years and 10 is fine. Other people say forever, and they get challenged immediately, like you have. Other people say 325 years. I want to know what happens in about that span of time, because I reckon that interesting things are going to happen. So I'm not quite in agreement with you that living longer is boring. And of course, Kevin, it's all on the proviso that the kind of health that you're enjoying at present can be maintained. And bear in mind that 300 years ago, the average death for age was around about the 50 mark. So we've already added 20 years in a few hundred years. So, and people look fine in their 70s, I can assure you of that. So, you know, and this life force, this pull of what's out there is so strong that I'm not surprised that many people want to go on. Isn't that all right?
Of course it's all right, but then obviously some people don't go on forever, or some people die prematurely. You might say prematurely, or they die when they die. So, you know, I was just reading the other day about a woman who died of ovarian cancer and she's 48. We still have to have a mechanism by which we can cope with our own mortality, regardless of the span of our life. Some people, I'm not saying it's like fatalistic, but you either die in fear and in panic, fleeing, thinking, how could this terrible thing be happening to me? Or we can, through learning, educating ourselves through a public social ritual around death, around different kinds of death, by being more open societally about death, we can learn to understand this mechanism by which in our generation, not all of that generation will die at the same time. Some will die before others. Some will die needlessly. Some might die with their own hand. Some, there'll be this strange acts of fate that will take these people away. But that is part of the sort of human condition. It's not just this one story. I mean, learning how to cope with death is not just learning about my death. It's also learning about the social experience of death. How do I cope with the death of others around me, or others in my life who have lost people who they love? So the more individualistic that we turn in the Western death machine, the more we just sort of think about, it's my death, it's really, really important, then the more fearful we become. And strangely, although I've talked earlier about like the sight of the dead and how that has become rarer and rarer amongst English society, people certainly don't feel more accepting about their own mortality. If anything, people are more afraid, more isolated, and more grief-stricken because they've removed these social rituals.
Sure, sure. Now, something else that your book made me think of is what people feel about death, whether they're afraid or not. And one of the things that I've experienced most frequently around death, either members of the family dying or relatives or friends or others, is unfinished business. So not so much fear of death, but regret and guilt to do with unfinished business. And then they go and pour it all out, either at the graveside or something like a wake, more like, we don't quite have wakes here, something else. And they go on about it. And I feel like saying, why did you say that to Sally before she died? And sometimes I've come away from funerals thinking 90% of this stuff should have been said to Jim a year ago. And furthermore, when I saw Jim, and you asked how many, and I can just about do a handful, he was like ivory, like cold ivory. And the feeling I had was that Jim was gone. Jim was gone, gone, gone. And weeping over him onto this cold, solid thing that it was immobile when you touched it, served no purpose at all. And what the only purpose that his death served was, I won't forget to say to Peter what I wish I'd said to Jim. In other words, don't make the mistake of leaving too much unfinished business. There will always be some, because you never know when somebody's going to die. But I kept looking in your book for how people deal not with the death of someone, but a kind of preparation for death. Do you recognize that?
Yeah. Well, yeah. You see, I think again, I don't want to sort of, let's change the last 40 years of history, although it is an interesting, the development of death in the English society. But a public ritual which you are exposed to from relatively early on as a teenager, even selfishly as a teenager, I actually went to a wake on the island after the dance one night in order to get some free grub, sandwiches, cigarettes, as we were then smoking them. We went along what we called to the wake for the crack, for the sort of jokes and good time, and we played these rather sort of off-humored wake games. Again, they're very, very ancient. But in all of that, we were accommodating ourselves to the notion of as an every other day event. And people talk about funerals, and then they often talk about, illnesses. And there's just much more social conversation. I mean, if you sort of think, if you were training to drive a car and you never spoke about it in public, and it only happened very sort of rarely to a few people, then it would be incredibly difficult to drive a car. But obviously, if you're talking about driving a car all the time and it's happening and people going on and on about this, and this is what we did, it becomes easier to talk. So I've often had, obviously, conversations with people talk in great detail about the illness of so-and-so and the fact that they're dying and that the acceptance that they're dying. So when my own father died in the village here in Achill, lots and lots of people came to see him before he died. In fact, so many people came to see him. It was like a kind of wedding feast. There was a queue of suitors in the sitting room waiting to go into the room to speak to this dying man. And we might find that pretty excruciatingly embarrassing.
Was he still compos mentis?
Oh, absolutely, yes. I mean, people were old school friends who he hadn't seen in years and years. Some people he hadn't seen in 50 years. Sometimes a few strangers. We were a bit baffled as to why they were there ourselves. But they didn't have the sort of public shame around death. They felt far more comfortable socially going up to someone and acknowledging that they were there on a kind of visit. You were allowed to, if my father had wished to say, well, look, I'm taking another pill and the doctor assures me, he knew he was dying of pancreatic cancer and he was very stoic and accepting. But it was a much more socially conscious, socially public ritual that the imminence of his death. So again, these sort of conversations. Now, going back to what you were saying, Matt, about you weeping or not weeping over Jim, but actually, I think the bodies of our dead are very important because they are the locus of our grief, and they are also these. In their transformation that we have both our perceptive, emotional, and clearest existential understanding of mortality.
Yeah, but I wept over letters that Jim sent me. That's when the tears flowed, not his body. I want to. Isn't
Could I just interject?
Don't animals stop when their heart stops, and we're animals?
But you see, one of the problems about grief within Western society at the moment is that people don't really die in America and in England; they disappear. That you see them in the hospital, and then they obviously they die in the hospital, and then you never see them. You never see this transition state into death. That what happens very common in England is that your beloved one dies in hospital. You see them in the last visit. You might hear about it. You might be there in the actual ward and the deathbed, but you may not. And then a month later, or 6 weeks later, you're in a crematorium in South London or in Swindon, and there's this sort of box, and the undertaker comes in with the 4 pallbearers, and then you are burying this person who you might have spent 30 years of your life with. And there is that great psychological gap. I mean, you're right. We are human beings. We are tactile, sensual beings. So the absence, of course, we can intellectually construct that, yes, Jim or Jean or Agnes or whoever is gone, is dead. But it is a huge psychological impact, is that hole, that black psychological hole, what has happened to them?
Yeah, well, it's also
where have they gone?
Yeah, it's also a bardic tradition to have good discussion, to try to work things out. Now, you've quoted the ancients a few times. Plato, one of them, said we should dry up our tears. Now, he was a bit of a rationalist, and I'm not advocating that entirely, but also another writer said that feelings can be too easily let loose, which on later examination proved to be flawed. In other words, sometimes we're getting something mixed up. We want to love, but we're getting it mixed up with something sentimental rather than something that is truly emotional and truly meaningful. And so it's a very tricky area, isn't it? And isn't it all right that, because you've slightly divided the Irish and the English here, but I'm sure they have lots in common. But this notion that, that the English might be a little bit staid and a little bit non-weepy and a little bit cross this road rather than say, I'm sorry, your friend died, and that the Irish don't do that. And of course, we'll meet many exceptions to that, but that it may not be an entirely bad thing, because sometimes when I'm sad about something and too many people remind me of that sadness, especially 6 months later, when I really am trying to recover from it, it kind of reawakens the trauma rather than the love. And so there's something to be said for drying up those tears, as Plato suggests, don't you think?
I think in what you've just said, Matt, is the use of the word trauma. That we increasingly we attach, we have grief trauma, and we have like workshops about grief, and grief has become a problem, and death has become traumatic. But death has certainly not become traumatic. Death has always been, death. It affects people in different ways. And I suppose you're right that we should have this debate. What is the best way for the vast majority of people in society to cope with and understand and overcome the grief and feelings that they have towards their own mortality and the loss of those they love? Do we do that in a way that sort of restricts and silences and lessens the presence of the dead and the physical dead? It's great just to go back to the actual physicality. How many corpses have you seen, and why is it so strange? And what would one learn by? One of my daughters sort of wants to do medicine, and she's like incredibly excited about meeting up with her first corpse. So we can see that it's educative. So, but I think it's educative on a general societal level, because in that moment of seeing a dead one of us, you learn so much more about your own mortality, the nature of human life. It's not abstract. It is there physically in front of you. I think that I would say that the dead, the physical remains of the dead are important because the being that you loved, Jim, did not exist outside that body. And that contrast between who that person was and then their physical, we say a contrast, their physical remains, the words that they use. But that was also, to put it slightly religious, the tabernacle of that person too, because they didn't exist outside that. And that's why actually we do have this very ancient belief that one of the reasons why we were appalled by murderers is that they hide the bodies of the dead, that they desecrate the dead. We still retain this belief in military terms that the bodies of warriors must be returned from the battlefield to sacred ground. This is what happened with the British war dead during Afghanistan. The Americans did this in Vietnam. We still hold to this belief that we need to take the bodies of the dead home. We need to look after them. We need to, even for like murderers, that we recover the remains and give someone a proper, decent funeral.
Yeah.
And that's this old belief, again embedded, about the right of burial.
Yeah.
That we have an obligation to the dead to bury them properly.
It's Kevin, we need a much longer life, you and I, to deal with what you do in this book, which I almost want to suggest should be retitled 9 Suggestions about how to deal with death, rather than 9 rules, because it raises so many questions. The time has just flown by and we've raised more. And I'm so pleased that you touched on coming home, because anyone who's watching this, linked to this particular talk and the discussion of this book, is a film that Kevin and others in Ireland have made, and it's by the seashore, and it has music in it, and it has more about coming home, not quite like death, but another kind of coming home. I urge you, if you're in the mood and you've got a glass of wine when you've been listening to this, to just switch on to that. It's about 10 minutes and you'll enjoy that. But Kevin, I'm afraid life's not long enough. You and I have to stop now. And the Swindon Festival of Literature wants to say to you for coming to talk about your book, which is available from all good bookshops and online. The Swindon Festival of Literature says, Kevin Toolis, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Matt. And I hope one day soon that I'll be able to actually once again stroll through the streets of Swindon, and we will be able to continue this discussion about books, life, mortality, death, and the ongoing wonders of this mortal world, which I hope both of us are around for a few more years to enjoy.